Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to our webinar. Thank you so very much for joining us today. The two guys who are going to be chatting through a couple of the topics is going to be Mr. Norman Brook and Mr. Mark Hardwick. Just by way of an introduction, Norman Brook is a member of the International Safeguards for Children in Sport. It's an international, he is an international sports consultant and former Olympic coach and former CEO of the UK National Sports Federation. He has been active in safeguarding in sport for 25 years plus. And Mr. Mark Hardwick is the MD of The Guardian, and he is the specialist child abuse investigator. He's been in the field of child protection, specializing in that field for over 25 years. He has extensive experience in investigation and disciplinary procedures, and he's also had quite a lot of experience in the safe sports policy development. So I'm going to hand you over to Mark now. Just before I do that, if I can just say, I know a lot of you have been asking questions in terms of getting a recording of the session today. That information is going to be shared at the end of this presentation. We are going to be putting this presentation up onto YouTube, and the details of how you can access that will be at the end of the presentation as mentioned. If you do have any questions through the presentation, if I can just ask you, there is a little chat option at the bottom of your screen. If I can just ask you to pop your questions into the chat, and we will address all the questions at the end of the presentation. One final thing is that you will notice that everybody is muted. If I can just ask that you keep your microphone muted, because it can just disrupt the presentation. That's all from our side. I'm going to hand you over to Mark. Enjoy.
Thanks, Rox. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. So I wanted to tee off this morning by just kind of talking into the reason for today's webinar. And you know, in discussing with Norman prior and setting up towards this thing, you know, we look at various pieces of legislation and various things that are in place causing federations to certainly be taking a more active role in the safeguarding space. The IOC consensus statement of 2016 basically says that all sports organizations have to implement and monitor policies and procedures for safe sport. They also need to deliver an education program for all the main stakeholders. It also goes on to say that appoint or work with qualified designated personnel responsible for safe sport programming and and athlete welfare. We know that last year there was a proposed policy manual that went out by SASCOC and asking that all federations needed to implement their safeguarding policies. Most international federations expect their national federations to have safeguarding policies and procedures. And then in 2017, the Kazan Action Plan, which obviously South Africa was a signatory to, really called for all national sport bodies to have formal policies to protect children, youth, and all vulnerable groups within the sports space. All national sport bodies have to have a nominated child protection officer and a nominated sport integrity officer. And then all athletes, coaches, and sport officials have participated in at least one training or orientation session on the protection of children, youth, and other vulnerable groups. And in the space that we've been working in and in the federations that we've been appointed as the safeguarding partner to, one of the big challenges that does come out is the consideration of the magnitude of a project like this and how one would look at rolling it out. So I think today what we're trying to do is really answer any questions in that space and really kind of create a scenario where there is an understanding that what we have to do is a big task, but it's not necessarily a difficult task. One of the things that's come up for me in terms of working with federations is that I think we need to bear in mind that in the space of safeguarding, you know, we can make a call where we meet and tick legislative boxes, but there is absolutely a bigger responsibility in this space because there's moral and ethical responsibilities that I think we have to be considering. You know, I feel that if you're meeting the absolute minimum standard and just getting yourself legislatively compliant, that's very possibly where it starts, and that can't be where it ends, because I think this is something that's going to be ongoing and we're going to be looking at addressing forever. So I just would like to quickly share my screen over here and get onto the PowerPoint. Okay. All right, so from an agenda perspective and the things that I want to address today, so we're going to look at safeguarding policies and code of conduct. We're going to look at safeguarding officers and really what they need to be doing right from club level through to national level. Recruitment and the legal requirements of vetting. We're going to be looking at safeguarding training, reporting and managing of complaints, because I know that does become a big challenge, and a lot of the federations I've worked with is where they tend to come unstuck. Communication process and how vital that is just in your safeguarding space. And then safeguarding management solution and how we can kind of look at implementing something along those lines. So Norman and myself are going to, we'll be presenting at different times on different things. And so as we go through it, you'll just hear the two of us, presenting at different times. Okay. Norman.
Hi everybody, I'm very pleased to join you this morning and to talk to you about safeguarding in sport, which is quite a passion for me. The question is why should national sports federations be implementing safeguarding policies and codes of conduct? Well, first of all, it's becoming an increasingly a requirement. I think through your international federations, through the Olympic movement, and I think increasingly through governments, requirements to get grant aid, etc. There is a growing requirement to have safeguarding policies and codes of conduct, and this is just going to increase. So the time is right now for sports federations in South Africa to be looking at this and putting these policies into place. The other thing is that not all transgressions in sport or linked to sport are criminal. Yes, you do have cases where there will be criminal proceedings and someone will go to prison as a result of their conduct in a sporting context, but not all the cases are like that. So we need policies. A lot of the issues will be dealt with through disciplinary processes within sport, and therefore you need policies to inform that disciplinary process and to set the benchmark against which you can actually go forward with a disciplinary case. Also, the policies promote appropriate conduct and best practice in the sport, and ultimately that's what we want to have. We want to keep children and other vulnerable adults safe while they participate in sport, and we should be promoting good conduct, appropriate conduct and best practice. And finally, the policy drives the procedures. So on the one hand, you need to have a policy. On the other hand, you need procedures to implement the policy. Next slide, please. I think, Mark, you're going to talk to
so I just wanted to unpack on this a little bit. So in terms of safeguarding policies, these are, so as the Guardian is something that we obviously roll out into federations. These are some of the policies that are addressed in our policy manual. We're going to go through today, what we should be doing with regard to recruitment, sex offenders register, child protection register. We're going to be looking at what information needs to be flowing within the organisation, because there are situations where if a child does make a disclosure, there is absolutes that you have to be doing with regard to the moving of that information, but there's also absolutes in terms of the fact that you can't give out certain information. It needs to remain confidential. So what is the policy around that? We've looked at photography, videography, media policies, and all of those have legislation that drives them, but also obviously best codes of practice. Sexual harassment is something that we notice that we see a lot within federations. So kind of just, I don't want to go through every single one of these policies, but just to kind of have a look at the policies that one should be looking at and considering within a policy manual. Just to finish it off by saying that our policy manual does align quite extensively to the requirements called for within the SASCOC safeguarding policy. So it's something to consider, and something that we could chat about outside of this meeting if anybody was interested. So yeah, that's kind of on the policy side. Then Norman.
Yeah, so the next sort of thing you have to get in place after having a policy is you have to get someone in your sports organisation responsible for managing the day-to-day programme of safeguarding. So that person's often called a focal point. We often talk about who is the focal point in the organisation to whom you go to with regard to safeguarding issues. Who is the person, the focal point, who's driving the safeguarding, is looking at the risk assessments, is looking at what needs to be implemented within the sports organisation. They're often called safeguarding officers, they're sometimes called welfare officers, but they're basically the same person. It's some person or persons within the organisation who take responsibility for safeguarding in that organisation. We usually recommend that that's two people, one male and one female, and they're managing safeguarding at federation level, at a club level, and at events. So when you have major, big events, national championships, things like that, there should be somebody appointed as a safeguarding officer for those events. They receive and action complaints or concerns. They drive the process of safeguarding within the organisation, and they need to be suitably qualified and trained for the context in which they're deployed. And later on we'll be talking about some of the training that's available to train, to train everybody, but also to train safeguarding officers. Mark?
One of the things that's vitally important is having a look at your recruitment and vetting processes in terms of what is your policy from a national level. So I know that the National Federation literally cannot get involved in the recruitment of coaches and administrators right down to club level, but there needs to be policy, there needs to be rules, there needs to be guidelines that causes every single club to essentially be behaving, in the same manner. I know that, in South Africa, we have the Sexual Offenders Register, we have the Child Protection Register, and they are two checks that have to be done, and they have to be done because the law essentially calls for it to be done. So when we cut it back and we look at the Sexual Offenders Register as an example, the Sex Offenders Register is in South Africa available to 3 demographics. Basically, the first demographic to whom it's available to is a person in respect of themselves. So you could check to see if your name was on there. The second demographic, very obviously, is law enforcement. But where it gets legal in terms of within the sports space is that the legislation says that an employer who employs an employee and that employee may have access to or come in contact with children needs to ensure that that person is cleared against the Sex Offenders Register. Now, very often people will go, well, hold on a second, if I do a criminal check, then, I've got all that covered, because surely if someone has a sexual offense, then they may not have, they have to have a criminal conviction or a criminal record. That's not necessarily true. So there are circumstances in which it's possible for your name to be on the Sex Offenders Register and not have a criminal check. I'm not going to unpack the nuts and bolts of that at the moment, but it is important. That piece of legislation goes on to say that an employer is defined as if you have any operational management over a person. So it does define an employee as someone who is remunerated and someone who fills the capacity of volunteer. if you have any organizational or management authority over a certain person, one would define them as an employee. And so that person, so that there is an obligation to ensure that they are all checked. And let's kind of just ensure that we're not just thinking about coaches here, because we also need to be talking about administrators, we need to be talking about volunteers, we need to be talking about people who may chaperone on tours. All of those people would need to ensure that those clearances are done. The Child Protection Register has very similar criteria as defined in the Sex Offenders the Sex Offenders Act. The difference being that within the Child Protection Register, the gateway to put someone onto that register is a bit different. So within the Sex Offenders Register, it specifically talks about a matter dealt with in court, where in the Child Protection Register, the legislation says if you've been found guilty in any forum recognized by law. So as an example, a disciplinary inquiry is a forum recognized by the Labour Relations Act, so it's recognized by law. And so someone could be found guilty in a disciplinary inquiry, let's say for corporal punishment in a school environment, and be dismissed, and their name may be placed on the Child Protection Register. For that person to be working in a space where they would still be engaging with children, whether that be through a club or through the federation, that federation or club would be running foul of the law. And when one talks about running foul of the law, failing to get the first 15 minutes. Greg, sorry, can you just mute your mic? Or Roxy, can you just mute Greg's mic, please? Thanks. So in terms of running foul of the Sex Offences Register legislation and the Child Protection Register legislation, the law says that failing to do the checks, and people get very confused in this space because they kind of go, well, there isn't anybody that is on my staff that this has happened, but the law doesn't say that if you have someone employed who has a previous conviction, you can be prosecuted. The law kind of says failing to check is prosecutable. And essentially the legislation says that failing to check on the Sex Offences Register is prosecutable by 7 years imprisonment, and child protection is 10 years. So there's quite a motivation to get that done from a legal perspective, but obviously one needs to be considering obviously from a moral perspective as well. There is no law in South Africa that says that we have to do criminal checks on employees, but it certainly is best practice, and it certainly would be my advice would certainly be to ensure that you have policy that says within this organization a criminal check should be done. There's obviously value in reference checks and interviews, and I'm going to allow Norman to take us through those values.
Yeah, I think the important thing here is to remember that potential abusers of young people and adults in sport may not have committed any crime in the past, and so they won't necessarily be flagged up when you do these various checks. So we need to do a little bit more than that. I'm just going to tell you a very quick story. If you want to go to CNN News later on today and have a read, this story is up on CNN News today. It's about 22-year-old Choi Sakayan, who was a female international triathlete. And then earlier this month, she committed suicide. And the reason she committed suicide was that she was being emotionally and physically abused or bullied by her coach and some of the other triathletes. And it's possible at the end of this, and here's a young person who's lost their life. It's possible that this young person's, the people who were doing the bullying, will not be criminally charged. And yet, they're obviously not the kind of people that we want working in sport. So the recommendation is that we do more than the criminal checks, that we also do reference checks. We go to previous employers of a coach, for example, and check to see what their opinion on that person is. Is there any reasons why they might not be suitable to be coaching young people in sport? And we should also hold interviews with the person before we employ them. Now I know the interview side is particularly challenging in amateur sport, where you've got where sports organisations, sports clubs are so desperate for people to come and volunteer and work in the clubs. But if you can adopt a system of interviewing, it very often helps stop the wrong kind of people coming into the sport.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Norman.
Okay, so we'll go to the next slide, which is on who needs safeguarding training. So we've got a safeguarding policy and procedures, we've got safeguarding officers in place. The next biggest thing that sports organisations need to address is safeguarding training. We need to raise levels of awareness around safeguarding in our sports organisations, and we need to make sure that those people responsible for safeguarding are trained, they know what to do, and we also need to make sure that everybody associated with the sport knows what to do if they've got some concerns. So who needs training? Well, we need training for any person in the sports organisation who has regular contact with children or other vulnerable groups or vulnerable adults. Regular contacts, usually at least once or twice a month. If it's a one-off occasion, they don't have to go through the training. But if they're if they're working with children and adults in your clubs every month, repeatedly over a period of time, then they should in fact go through training. The focal points, so the safeguarding or welfare officers in sports clubs need training. They need to know what their role is and how they're going to perform their role. National Federation officers need training in what their role is and how to perform their role. And then finally, I think it's important that we engage with athletes and their parents and actually have some sort of training with them so that they know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable behaviour or conduct by coaches and other people in the sport. And as importantly, they know what to do if they have concerns. They know who they can go to raise their concerns. Okay, Mark?
I just wanted to just elaborate a little bit and kind of go, I know that very often when we refer to vulnerable athletes in sports, the go-to place in the head is to consider children. But I think it's important that we kind of understand that vulnerable athletes are defined when we start looking at UNICEF. It's not just children, but young adults as well, people with obviously mental or physical disabilities. Those persons would be defined as vulnerable. Competitive athletes or athletes performing at a high level, they're very vulnerable to manipulation, and obviously the amount of time that they spend getting into those teams. And so it is possible that they can be taken advantage of. Women are obviously more vulnerable than men are, elderly persons, and really any person who I suppose is in a position where their future or their ability to move forward, that future is held by another person. It's important to bear in mind that those persons can very easily be taken advantage of and would be defined as vulnerable. And so when we talk about the implementation of policies and the implementation of welfare and safeguarding officers, that those people understand that it's their responsibility to safeguard more than just a person who hasn't turned 18. To elaborate a little bit more on the safeguarding training that Norman was talking about, and how it's important that we realize that safeguarding is not just the responsibility at federation level. It's bigger than just implementing a dusty policy that sits on the top shelf. It needs to become an active document. It needs to become a working document. So, what we would look at is if we were going to assist in the, the development and the training Safeguarding Awareness Certificate is really the entry level, and it's the level at which every single person who may, through the club or through a tournament, through an event, may come in contact with children. And it's not just about that person, ensuring that they're not doing anything inappropriate. But more importantly, it brings so much more security and safeguarding to the Federation as a national body when we've given an understanding to any person that's out there. They become the eyes and ears of the Federation. They're able to see what is happening. If there is something that seems inappropriate, maybe there is, somebody is spending too much time in a change room with vulnerable persons. Those kinds of people need to be knowing that is inappropriate, and what do I do? How do I report that? That is so vital. Also, when we look at, when we look at the psychology of a disclosure of a child, very often parents will come out and say, if anything happens to my child, they will come and tell me because I am their best friend. And well, interestingly, statistics tell us that the demographic to whom a child is most likely to disclose is another child or their peer. Strangely enough, the second biggest demographic to whom a child may disclose would someone who would fulfill a teacher or coach perspective, because they certainly fill a different element of that child's life, and so when the child chooses to make that disclosure, it is so important that the person to whom they make the disclosure has an understanding of how to deal with that disclosure. Receiving the disclosure wrong or doing something that isn't correct at the time of disclosure can have such huge ramifications down the line when we end up in court. Defense attorneys can argue things like leading of evidence, etc., etc., etc. So in this space of Safeguarding Awareness Certificate, we kind of ensure that everybody has a basic understanding, firstly, of what is legally required, secondly, of what they should be on the lookout for and what they should be listening for, thirdly, ensuring that touching an athlete when training, and sometimes it's important, it's a part of the development, it's a part of the coaching, but ensuring that firstly, it's appropriate, secondly, do you have the person's permission, etc., etc., etc. And then, finally, if a child does choose to make a disclosure, at least we know that the disclosure is made in such a way or is collected in such a way that it is usable going forward. And so the Safeguarding Awareness Certificate is certainly something that we suggest that everybody that's working in the space should be doing. Designated Safeguarding Officer, or DSO, that is at club level. It is obviously goes more depth than the Safeguarding Awareness Certificate. Obviously, depending on the sport or the discipline, most sports are have both boys and girls, or male and female, and certainly if it's a sport that is both male and female, definitely you should have a male and female safeguarding officer within the club. If the club is really small, or if we consider clubs that may be in very rural areas, which are almost, they're just basically clubs on paper, it might be then an idea to consider having a DSO that is shared between one or two clubs. But that person then is responsible for ensuring that when or the child or somebody arrives at the club, safeguarding measures are in place. Things like what is the policy of this federation in a change room? What is the change room policy? And is that policy up and available for people to see within the club? What is the golden rules when it comes to safeguarding for this federation, and are those up within the club? Does the persons in the club understand the policies and the procedures coming out of those policies? If one club is visiting another club in a competitive environment, the DSO of the hosting club needs to ensure that their club is set up in such a way that they can receive vulnerable athletes. And the club that is traveling or touring to the other club, the DSO at that club needs to make sure that the movement of those vulnerable athletes is secure, is safe. The person that they're moving with, the transport organization and company, those things need to be dealt with, and they need to be understood at club level. And then a senior safeguarding officer, which is a far more in-depth course, and that is something that I believe should be at national level. Again, depending on the size of your federation, very, very small federations may look at, almost joining together and outsourcing that solution to a senior safeguarding officer. Your other federations would have senior safeguarding officers within their organization. And then, when we start looking at the really big federations and the understanding that obviously the bigger the federation is, the likelihood that something could go wrong increases just because there's more vulnerable athletes. There could be a consideration to have more than one male and female, say, senior safeguarding officer, even to the point that you could consider having senior safeguarding officers at national level. But obviously every single federation would need to kind of look at their specific dynamic, and we're obviously very comfortable to kind of assist and advise and guide in terms of how that looks. But it is important that people and persons who are aware and understand what safeguarding is and how vital it is, that you get those people inside your organization. You ensure that that skill set is available in the organization, either through an outsourced service provider or obviously having the skills in-house, and make sure that they align not just to your policy, but also to the ethics and ethos and best code of practice for your specific federation.
Can I come in there, Mark?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of tell a little story, because it kind of relates to the role of the safeguarding officer and the fact that this is not just about, it's not just about legislation and paper documents and so on. It's about making sure that your safeguarding policies actually become real living documents and so on. I went to visit a swimming coach in Dublin in the very early hours of the morning. In swimming they bring all the children there to swim before they have their breakfast and go off to school. So it was very, very early. And when I arrived, there was two things that really impressed me. The first one was the number of parents that were sitting in the gallery watching their children train at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. And the other one was that all the staff were uniformed. They all had nice bright orange polo shirts on and were easily identified. And I said to the coach, I said, this is incredible, this is impressive. And he said to me, this is part of our safeguarding policy. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we've had a lot of big cases of child abuse in swimming in Ireland, and we're very conscious about safeguarding our children. So first of all, the parents all used to come and they used to sleep in their cars whilst the children were training. And then we decided that the more eyes that we could have in the swimming pool, the better. And so we asked the parents if they would not sleep in their cars and if they would in fact come into the gallery and keep an eye on their children. And so the second thing we decided is we didn't want anybody on the swimming deck other than the qualified coaches who are part of the club. And so we decided that we would put them in bright orange shirts so that if any adult was on the side of the pool and wasn't wearing a shirt, they would immediately be challenged because they were not meant to be there. And so it's a kind of example of the kind of work that can be done by the club safeguarding officer along with the club in implementing really practical measures which are designed to safeguard children and safeguard vulnerable adults at the club. So just a little interjection there, but I think it kind of helps to bring this alive, that this is not just about paperwork and ticking boxes. This is about taking real action to safeguard children.
Absolutely, Norman, and I think it goes into where we're going. There is a place where legislation and policy stops, and there is a place where the heart for safeguarding kicks in, and having persons on the ground who are driven to ensure that it's better than just ticking the boxes is vital. So yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to talk into now, investigations, code of conduct, and how disciplinary procedures, will play out. So very often the time that we, as the Guardian would get called into a federation, where it generally all starts, is at this point where something has gone wrong, and then we're called in to come and assist with the investigation or with the inquiry or whatever the case may be. And then coming out of that, we look at putting safeguarding in place. And obviously, it's not rocket science to see that we've got that the wrong way around. We obviously want to be putting in the policies, putting in the safeguarding measures first, so that we can eliminate as much of this as possible. However, ensuring that we get this stage right is vital for two reasons. Number one, it tells the athletes and it tells the public that we're serious about not allowing this type of behavior, whatever it may be, within the federation. And number two, it ensures that we can safeguard any other athletes going down the line in the future who this person may decide that, once being kicked out of a certain club or being kicked out of a certain federation, they may want to align to a different one. And so it's important that we ensure the paperwork and all of these things are held correctly. So the process, as you can see on the screen, first and foremost, is obviously the reported concern. And I think at that point, it's very important that we be guarded against a knee-jerk reaction. We be guarded against, going straight after the perpetrator. I do agree that we need to ensure that all safety is in place post the original disclosure. But we need to be aware that when a disclosure is made, unless the disclosure is made with evidence that is so unrefutable that we start making accusations. Once a concern is reported, we do need to consider an investigation, whatever that means. It may be speaking to witnesses, it may be finding out if there was video footage, etc., etc., etc. Sometimes if it's a criminal case, it may mean collecting evidence like DNA evidence, etc., etc., etc. But it is vitally important that an investigation is done after a concern is reported. I do believe that a quick step to ensure that if there is any validity in the concern, that any ability to continue with that behavior is mitigated. But I think we need to be guarded against somebody says something, they saw something, they heard something, they thought something, and next thing a person is labeled, as a child abuser. It's important that we, maintain perspective post the concern. Then the investigation that is to be done, obviously depending on the disclosure, the level of investigation that is needed, one needs to consider. So if we consider, for example, I'm going to use an example like sexual harassment. Now, sexual harassment is such a broad, defined thing. So sexual harassment, for example, as a standalone, is not a criminal charge. So you can go to the police station and open up a case of sexual harassment. You could open up a criminal case of sexual assault. You could open up a charge of rape and various other crimes defined within the Sexual Offences Act. But sexual harassment is something that is more geared towards your HRIR disciplinary inquiry environment. And so it's important that we understand what has happened in that space. Secondly, if the crime is against a child, so a person that hasn't turned 18, then there is a legal obligation to ensure that that is reported to the police. So there was a time in South African history, the law not so long ago, 10, 12 years ago, that it was okay to report to Department of Social Development, or the old used to be called welfare in those days. But today it has to be reported to the SAPS if there is a crime against a child. But I want to be guarded here because I want to ensure that we go, once we've handed it over to the police, the obligation of the federation is not to dust off our hands and say, we've handed it over for various reasons. The first is that there is a possibility, certainly within South Africa, that the investigation done by law enforcement may not be of a standard to find the person guilty. And so the person then is found not guilty. If the policy within the federation is that the person must be found guilty in a criminal case, then the person would be able to come back into the federation, and quite possibly the only reason they were found not guilty was as a result of poor prosecution or poor investigation on behalf of the state. So the second thing is in understanding that the need in terms of, it's called the burden of proof, but the burden of proof in a criminal matter versus the burden of proof in a civil matter is different. So in a criminal matter, the Latin term is prima facie evidence, or beyond all reasonable doubt. So for me to find someone guilty in a criminal space, I have to have evidence that goes beyond all reasonable doubt, and then they can be found guilty. In a civil matter or in a disciplinary inquiry, the burden of proof is much lower. The burden of proof is I've gone blank. A balance of probabilities. And so the chairperson within a disciplinary inquiry needs to have a look at both sides of the story and decide which one they believe is more probable. And so if there is a lot of evidence, a lot of witnesses saying that a coach by the name of Mark has been inappropriate and he seemed to be inappropriate, etc., but no one there's no witnesses, well, we kind of start going down the road of we don't have beyond all reasonable doubt proof, but balance of probabilities. And so based on the balance of probabilities, we can still find the person guilty in an internal disciplinary hearing. We can also bring a sanction in that disciplinary hearing of saying that the person is not allowed to be in our federation anymore, they can't coach in our federation anymore, etc., etc., etc. If we allow the burden of proof to be what needs to be brought in a criminal matter, we then allow so often the ability for someone to come back into the federation, even although they are guilty, only because the burden of proof was unable to be met in the criminal space. Additionally, it's also important to understand that in a criminal investigation, South Africa's judicial system is sometimes very, very slow. And in certain courts in the country, if you end up, from the day you end up in court, so excluding the investigation that's happened prior to that, it can sometimes take up to 2 years before you get to a trial date, just for various reasons and remands and load shedding and magistrates not available. I mean, there's so many reasons. And in those 2 years, by South African law, you're innocent until proven guilty. And so if your line in the sand is that the person needs to be found guilty before you can bring a sanction with them in a disciplinary space, the challenge is that you open up those 2 years, because you can't bring sanction based on the fact that your policy is saying we need a criminal conviction. So it's very important that your policy is worded in such a way that, or your code of conduct at least is worded in such a way so that we can kind of find the place where as a federation or as a club, you are empowered to deal with allegations. If there's a legal responsibility to report, absolutely 100% meet the legal obligation, but don't allow that to mitigate or remove the responsibility that you have as a safeguarding officer or as a federation. And then the right to appeal. The challenge that I've had with some of the federations we work with in terms of their appeal process is that it sometimes just isn't clear. And I think we need to ensure that in our code of conduct, the appeals process is very, very clear. Is the appeals process done within the federation? Is the appeals process done, for example, by SASCOC? Is it a situation where the evidence is sent through to the international federation for them to make a call? It's important that the federation, I believe, should be empowered to decide how their appeals process is made. But it's equally important that that appeals process is defined and clinical. It is very, very important. And sorry, I just want to go back to disciplinary hearing very quickly, because one of the other places that I very often see the ability with federations falling short it's important to understand that the person chairing the disciplinary inquiry needs to be completely unbiased. It needs to be a situation that they don't know the merits of the case until such time as they're sitting and hearing it for the first time. So those are kind of real important values that we need to be building into a code of conduct if it is something that you're wanting to develop internally from your side. Norman, I know that you, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, Mark, I would even go further than that. I think in order to make safe judgments and all this, there's a need for an independent investigation. There's a need for the tribunal that hears the disciplinary hearing to be independent, and for any appeals to be heard by an independent group of people. The responsibility at the moment for this disciplinary process rests with the national sports federations. And many national sports federations are failing really badly in this. They're either, the people who are sitting on the hearings have some interest in the case, or the outcomes are not being properly implemented, and so on and so on. It's a very unsatisfactory situation at the moment, and it can be unsatisfactory for both the claimant and the respondent, both parties. Sure. I can think of cases where the outcomes have not left the complainant happy and have not left the respondent happy either, right? At some stage there may be, like with the anti-doping, there may be an independent sports tribunal that will offer this kind of service. At the moment that's not there. So national sports federations do need to get their policies and procedures into place so that they've got a proper process of investigation, disciplinary hearing and appeals hearing.
Thank you. Thanks, Norman. Guys, this is a topic that is a very big topic, and so if there is anything that you would like us to elaborate on, or if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat room section at the bottom, and we can answer them at the end. I'd like to think that we're getting to all the questions, but if we're not, if there's something specific, please feel free to ask the question, and Norman and I will do what we can to help. Okay. One of the other elements that that we've looked at and seen huge value in is the ability for the federation to be able to open up a platform for anonymous reporting or for whistleblowing. We see very often that certainly within kids, but absolutely happens, right across the board. The old saying, kids will tease each other, snitches get stitches, and all of those kinds of things. But it's vital that if we create a platform that allows any athlete, any parent, any coach, anybody who feels that they can't come out and disclose, that they have the ability to disclose anonymously. Even if the disclosure that they're making is a feeling, even if it's a kind of going, I get a really bad feeling about this coach, or I get a really bad feeling about what's going on in this space, because we're sitting in a place, and I don't want to say that I'm old, but certainly the generation behind me definitely have a different skill set, and certainly in my opinion, maybe it's because of the time I lived, but certainly they don't have the skill set of dealing with conflict. They are absolutely far more conflict adverse than older generations. And so seeing something that is not okay, seeing something that is inappropriate, and being the person that stands up against it just doesn't fit very well within the younger generation. That's not to say that they don't have a strong sense of what's right and wrong, but finding the courage to stand up and be vocal about it tends to be challenging. So to give them a place where they can report on stuff that they've seen, or to give them a place where, you know, we spoke right in the very beginning about why it's so important for coaches to be able to receive a disclosure. And the reason being is that coaches fall into the same psychological bracket as teachers in the space of a victim, where that's the demographic to whom they are second most likely to disclose. The person that they're most likely to disclose to is a peer. And when a friend, a best friend, says, hey, you won't believe I've got the secret with so-and-so, but please don't tell anybody. We're placing a 14, 15, 16-year-old in a place where they are carrying a burden, and we've got to give them an outlet. We've got to give them a vehicle to allow that information to come out. It also allows us earlier on to open an investigation and to establish whether or not there is merit in the allegation. Because if there is merit in the allegation, when we look at some of these really, really big cases that have rolled out internationally and they've been prosecuted now in the last 10 years, most of those big cases, it's not a situation where we've got one coach who had a relationship with one vulnerable athlete. It's more a case of, you know, 15, 20, 30, in some of the cases over 100 athletes. And if we had the ability for them to report anonymously earlier, we could have engaged earlier and literally saved a whole lot more children. It is not the beginning and end of disclosure, but it certainly is a massive piece of the puzzle, and it certainly does play such a significant role. The Guardian, we have a very simple anonymous reporting app. It's downloadable. The athletes can download it, and they can report anonymously. That report will go directly to whoever you decide within the federation that it would go to. So it's not a case if it comes to the Guardian, anybody has any eyes on anything that wants to stay, that you want to keep within your federation, it would go to somebody who is trained as a safeguarding officer, and that person would know what to do with that information. What's really nice about this piece of software is that it allows the person receiving the information to talk back to the whistleblower, to talk back to the anonymous reporter, and never know their identity. And so I can go, listen, have you got any more information? Are you okay? How can I help? And generally what we find happening is, you know, we can't go down the road of prosecution quite often if we don't know who the victim is, if they're adamant they're wanting to stay anonymous. However, with all the other clients that we see using this piece of software, once the person has made the disclosure, especially when the disclosure they're making is about themselves, and they start talking to someone, once they've opened up that line of communication, something happens in their brain where they're going, I'm comfortable talking to this person, and in as much as their two-way communication is initially anonymous, the conversation generally moves to the place where the name of the person will be disclosed within that conversation. And we then very often can go down the road of prosecution and assistance. The other thing that the system or this anonymous reporting app will bring to the table is the ability to do push notification. And push notification through the system allows us to disseminate information to a specific club or to a specific area or to the whole federation, to everybody who has the app on the phone. And the reason that we've created this push notification function is for two reasons, two primary reasons. Number one being, if we are pushing out information to all of the athletes, to all of the parents, to all of the coaches, etc., they all have the app on their phone. If everyone has the app on the phone, well, then the person that's using it as an anonymous reporting app, well, they're protected by virtue of the fact that everyone has it. It's not just the whistleblower that has the app on the phone. The other thing that we find is that if the push notifications feature is used regularly, that the app stays front of mind as a very real solution, and athletes are more likely to engage it and use it. Additionally to that, there is literature coming from all over the world about the value of communicating safeguarding. And Norman's going to talk into that into the next slide, so I'm not going to go too much into that. But ensuring that as a federation, you are pushing out safeguarding information is absolutely vital. The final element of this anonymous reporting app is that it has a panic button. And what the panic button does is that the user, the person on the phone, would preload 3 people on there. That can be mom, dad, can be a safeguarding officer, can be anybody. When they push the panic button, what happens is automatically a website or a URL is created. That URL is SMSed to the 3 people who are loaded as contacts in the panic button. When you open up that URL, there is a web page dedicated specifically to your panic. And every 10 seconds, an image from the front camera and back camera is added to that website. Every 10 seconds, the last 10 seconds of audio is added to that URL. And every 10 seconds, the position, the GPS location of that is loaded to that URL. And that information keeps coming through every 10 seconds. And so if a child or someone is feeling like they're at risk, if someone has come into the change room and it's inappropriate, if they push that panic button and left the cell phone lying there, number one, it allows us to send assistance quickly. Number two, it also ensures that we collect evidence during the time of the trauma, and that evidence is then available at a later stage for disciplinary inquiries or for court cases. So it's a piece of software that is, it's a relatively inexpensive solution, and it brings a lot of solution. And talking, as I was saying just now, with regard to the push notification, making sure that we're pushing out information regularly is very important. I'm going to ask Norman just to kind of talk into how valuable it is that federations take an active role in disseminating safeguarding information.
Yeah, no, look, it's very important that the policies and procedures that a National Sports Federation develops become living documents. They have to be implemented. They have to be live. And one of the things we did when we were working with South African Gymnastics Federation, and we were producing all their policies and procedures and so on, I said, we talked about how we were going to communicate this. And I said, well, look, the first thing you have to do is you have to have all this information available easily on your website. And one of the things that works really well, both on their website and other international websites, is when you go to the front page of the website, there is a very clear button that is a safeguarding button. And you press that and you're immediately into all of the information on safeguarding. So there's no point in having all these policies and procedures if we hide them away, if they're sitting on somebody's top shelf and are never communicated to athletes, parents, coaches, clubs, etc. We need this stuff to be out there in order that we can safeguard children and other vulnerable adults. It's, I think, vital that everyone in the sport should know how to report a concern. There has to be, an easy way of doing that. Mark's app is one way of doing that, but there should be something on the website. That information about how to report should be well known by everybody. It should just be easy to report a concern if there is a concern. I think there's also a need to, we talked about the kind of 3 levels of training that Mark was offering, the basic awareness training around safeguarding in sport, the more specific training for the safeguarding officers at a club level or at a federation level. There's also a need to get children involved, parents and guardians involved, athletes involved, communities involved even, on what is acceptable and unacceptable conduct and where they can report their concerns. It's interesting, we here in Hout Bay, I live here in Hout Bay in Cape Town, and here in Hout Bay we had a basketball coach who absconded with a 12-year-old boy from the training venue that they use here in Hout Bay, and the 12-year-old boy sadly was allegedly raped and murdered. I think the case is still going through the court, so I'll use the word allegedly. interestingly enough, no one in the community, no one, the parents, the athletes, and the children, at no stage did anybody talk to them about how to stay safe. And I think that's a really important thing that we need to look at doing. To make these policies and procedures really work, we need to make sure that all athletes and their parents and guardians of their children really understand what this is all about and know what to do when there is a concern. Okay, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%, Norman. And I think just to elaborate on that a little bit is that we should almost have policy that causes, once every month or once every 2 months for any new parents or any new athletes within the club, there should be a safeguarding induction where we're telling those parents, listen, this is what we stand for. This is who we are. This is this is what safeguarding means to us. Because, if you consider a sport where, the example, Norman and I were chatting the other day, but the example that I was thinking of is you sit in a situation where you have a single mom. She is the single mom to a young boy, and the young boy is involved in a sport that she literally has never, ever been involved in or never played before. And so when she's standing on the side of the pit field or standing on the side of the track or whatever it is, pool, and she is, she's there supporting her kid, she has no idea what is and what isn't appropriate, because very simply, this has never been a part of her life before. And so I think it's very important that we look at induction. We tell parents, listen, this is where we're going. This is what's okay. If you see this, this is how you report it. And what we do is we create a place where there's just more eyes and ears. When we look at the example that Norman used just now, that swimming pool where, the coaches were expected to wear orange, I don't think it was a case of that they wanted the parents to be looking out for something that was going to go wrong, but more of a proactive scenario to go, when there are more eyes, the likelihood is far, far less. And so that's kind of what we want to create, and just to kind of tell a very, very quick story, and it's not specifically a sports story, but I worked with a UNICEF program talking into, children's homes, and one of the things where they're spoken to is that when a person is wanting to engage in a certain organization, a children's home, and it certainly applies to clubs, if I'm going to want to join that club because my motivation is to be able to access children inappropriately. Well, it's much like a housebreaker standing on the road and deciding which house they want to break into. The one with the high walls and the dogs and the electric fence and the burglar guards is going to be a far tougher target than the one where it has no walls and there's just windows and no burglar guards. And so you really want to be creating your federation in a space where only persons are coming in there where their goal is to coach, their goal is to the betterment of the sport, and that their motivation isn't in a place that is inappropriate or not aligned to what it is that you're trying to achieve. We need to make it as difficult as possible for people coming in that have ulterior motives. Then finally, before we get into any questions, so we are developing, and I think the only reason, and I really didn't want today to be about any level of sales. It's really about creating a place where we're giving federations tools that can help them get, go down this road. And so we are very close to completion of a piece of software that's going to align itself to safeguard management and specifically the administration. And when we look at safeguarding processes like clearances, training, policies, anonymous reporting, etc., there is a massive amount of administration involved in keeping all volunteer and employee records up to date. And although it's time consuming and sometimes seem menial, the task often falls by the wayside. And where it stands up is to kind of go, now something has gone wrong and we need those records. And if they haven't been kept up to date and if we haven't ensured that the safeguarding officer is up to date in terms of their training, if we haven't ensured that we have the necessary certificates ensuring that people have been cleared, etc., 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 when it comes down to the punch, when we're in the place where we have to start having disciplinary inquiries, calling for that evidence, calling for that information, if it's not available, can really place the club and federation at risk. And so, we've developed a piece of software. Like I say, it's very close to being completed. And essentially what it would do is it would allow, firstly, you as a federation or at national level to kind of look into your sports body and go, just as an example, I'm sitting in KZN, so I'm going to use KZN as an example. The clubs within KZN are the ones that have done the least when it comes to safeguarding, and you could kind of go down to certain clubs and go, these people haven't done what they need to do, and they're placing the organization at risk. So it's not just a filing piece of software, but it does have AR, where it allows you from a national perspective, from a global perspective, to firstly have a look, where does your club sit in the safeguarding space, and then where you can identify the challenges, drill down to where those challenges are, and then start making inquiries about why those solutions and why those things haven't been put in place. So again, it's one of those things that if it is something that you would find interest in, we're very obviously happy to have a conversation with you after this, and we can set up a Zoom meeting. So guys, really from what we were looking at presenting today, that kind of brings us to the end of it. The final slide has a QR code, so if anybody isn't on our sports safeguarding mailing list and you'd like to be, you can either drop me an email at sport@theguardian, or you can just scan the QR code and just fill in the questionnaire that comes up. So yeah, Rox, I want to hand over to you if there is any questions that have been posted within the chat room, if you could let us know, and then Norman and I can assist. And then after that, if there's anybody that has any questions, please feel free to ask, and we'll do the best we can to answer them.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Norman. That was very informative. So just a couple of questions that came through while you were presenting. The first one is there protocol in place for the recruitment and vetting of a foreign national? Because they may not be on any register in South Africa.
Yeah, I think the common practice is to ask for an international police clearance certificate. So you would ask them as part of your recruitment of that foreign coach, is to ask them to produce an international police clearance certificate. You would still do the checks in South Africa just in case, but you'd also want to do the reference checking, previous employers, etc. And you'd want when you're interviewing the person, to ask some questions about their attitude towards working with children and vulnerable adults.
100%. And just to elaborate, I think that it's important, I think the challenge comes when we look at international coaches, or certainly coaches coming from outside of South Africa. And when people ask that question, it almost feels like they're asking, can we do a criminal check outside of South Africa? And I think we've got to be very guarded. And I want to really elaborate what Norman was saying earlier, guarded against giving too much credence to the criminal check. There's a legal obligation to the sexual offences check and a legal obligation to do the child protection register check. But getting your name, having a criminal record means you've been caught. Not having one doesn't mean you've done nothing wrong. There is almost a place in me that if a reference check and an interview is done correctly, they are so much more valuable in vetting out people than even doing the crim check and sexual offences check. So, if somebody is coming from a country where we're battling to get a criminal check, we're battling to find that out, it needs to stay in the place it belongs. We need to be able to phone previous clubs. We need to be able to say, where were you between, 2016 and 2020? Because it's not on your CV. Why were you not at, why is that not in here? Why can I not speak to a reference during that time? It is so important because, and there is the golden question in that reference check. People sit in a situation now where, if someone's coming from overseas, like England, they're going to have GDPR and we can't tell you about their personal information. South Africa has POPI, there's Patriot Act in America, and we've got to be careful about what we do with people's information. But the golden question, and you've got to ask this in your reference check, is would you re-employ the person? They may be stuck in that they can't tell you why they wouldn't re-employ the person, but it certainly gives you a massive piece of information. If the person goes, he was a really good coach, but I definitely wouldn't employ him again. Why? Well, unfortunately, we're bound by a gag order, or there is an element that we can't talk into. But you need to, that is the golden question when doing that reference check. So thank you. Very good question. Rox?
Thanks, Mark. Okay, the next question, will the senior safeguarding officer be able to train the DSO and the other awareness officers within their federation?
So from the training perspective, what we are looking at doing, which is probably going to be available quite soon, the SAC training, which is the lowest one, the Safeguarding Awareness Certificate, is probably going to be available as, well, not even probably, it is going to be available as an online training. And so, and it will be, they'll be able to get certified through the online training, which is something we would open up obviously to all coaches and administrators. And you would obviously then be able to align your policy to say, we expect all administrators, or we expect all coaches, or whatever you deem to be right in your federation. And that can be done online. There is definitely the answer to the question is, can a senior safeguarding officer, once qualified, have the ability to train DSO? Yes, they will be able to. It is certainly something that one would need to consider, obviously outsourcing from a budget perspective versus bringing it in-house and allowing the senior safeguarding officer to do it. I think having done the senior safeguarding officer course is vital, and like I say, would give you the ability to do the training. However, having the experience, or having someone who's worked in this space, the training is very often a lot more valuable in getting someone who has worked in the space. But I do understand the question. I'm assuming the question comes from a perspective of outsourcing all the training, and it becomes a lot more expensive than getting the trainer in-house. So the short answer is yes, the in-house trainer would be able to go and do those trainings. Norman, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I think it would depend on the skill set of the senior safeguarding officer. I mean,
sure.
Are they, do they have the skills to do the training? Do they have enough, background knowledge and so on to be able to deliver that training? But certainly it could be done. I think that's happening now in gymnastics. We've trained a couple of people there who have got good training skills, and they're now taking on some of the safeguarding training, the basic safeguarding training. So yeah, I think it's possible.
I also think it's important that when we identify safeguarding officers, from your designated safeguarding officer right to your senior safeguarding officer, that it's not a situation of going, this person holds this position, and as a result of the position they hold, they should be the safeguarding officer. There is a personality type that aligns best to safeguarding, and I think it's something that you should consider before just identifying, this person is as an example, the chief operations officer in the federation, and so they are responsible for all the operations, and so it makes sense that they just have safeguarding dumped on their plate, because it is something that we need to consider, the type of person that you're going to identify in that space. Roxy?
Thanks, Mark. Next question. If a person behaves inappropriately towards a youngster, but it seems to be condoned by the parent, how would safeguarding apply here?
So I think that safeguarding, so when someone is behaving inappropriately, who condones that behavior is actually irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It's a situation of what are we talking about when we're looking at inappropriate behavior. Whether the parent condones it or not is really not relevant, because, you know, very often we'll have situations where the person abusing the child is actually the parent. So I think it's important that the report be laid and the investigation follow the same course as would happen if the parent had a huge problem with what was going on. I think that the investigator, and probably to Norman's point, the investigator being someone who's independent, needs to be investigating 100% with the best interests of the child at heart, as opposed to the best interests of the coach, the federation, the parent, the club. All of that needs to take second place. When the investigation is being done, it has to be done 100% with the child at the focus, at the pinnacle of that investigation, the best interests of that child. At the end of the investigation, whatever is found in that investigation, we need to sit in an understanding where we go, as those that are charged with safeguarding children, what we have done and how we have handled this has created a situation where this child is going to one day be a functional adult. That is what we have to achieve. And in all honesty, there are circumstances where I would say even sometimes criminal prosecution needs to take a back seat to the best interests of the child. You know, having worked in this field for a very long time, I have been a part of it. When we run an investigation, we arrest the pedophile, he gets 25 years imprisonment, everybody is high-fiving because we're super happy that that has happened. And then 2-3 years later, the child comes into her age of sexual awareness, she realizes what has happened, and she starts cutting herself, or even worse, commits suicide. We did not win. We failed. The pinnacle of the investigation has got to be the best interests of the child, irrelevant of the opinion of mom, dad, the coach, the federation, the club. The best interest of the child has got to be right in the middle of everything. Norman, I don't know if you want to comment.
Yeah, look, I think the challenge, the problem here is that, you know, it could, you know, someone's concerned about the behaviour of, say, a coach, and the parent seems to be going along with that. What is that behaviour? Is that behaviour poor practice? Is that behaviour inappropriate and unacceptable behaviour? Is that behaviour a criminal act, right? So, you know, it needs to be investigated. Somebody needs to look at that, you know? And even if it's just poor practice, it may be that the investigator says, look, I don't think this is unacceptable behaviour, but it's certainly not good practice. And it creates a culture within the club or the organisation where potential abuse could occur. And it may be that some sort of remedial action needs to be taken, you know, where a senior coach from the federation needs to come in and mentor that coach or whatever. So I think the key to this is whatever concerns are raised, they have to be looked at properly, and some action needs to result from that investigation.
100%. Roxy?
Next one, are the existing online educational programs or safeguarding training available for athletes, parents and coaches, like the USA Safe Sports Education?
There are. If you go to the IOC, so if you go IOC safeguarding, I think it's the 365 or something, I think they call the website. There are modules on there that athletes can go and look at. You know, it's got in a course format. UEFA football has just released some very good materials on their website. So there's definitely stuff out there that people could use. We always say in this space that the best training is face-to-face training, which is obviously challenging at the moment with the COVID-19 restrictions. But there are online modules that people can find and do if they wish to do that.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, and then next question is, how do we make sure that facility owners or managers are trained, especially in disadvantaged communities?
Trained, I'm assuming from a safeguarding training perspective, if we're talking about upskilling, upskilling the coaches in disadvantaged communities. Roxy, you want to just reread that question?
Sorry, let me just read that again. So how do we make sure that facility owners or managers are trained, especially in disadvantaged communities?
Well, one of the things that you would have in your policy is how how your policy impacts with your partners. So if you're using facilities, there would be something in your policy that would speak towards that. And there may be a need for you to engage with partners, so if I'm using a local authority facility, I may want to go and speak to the local authority about your safeguarding policy and about the measures that you think need to be put in place by the local authority. I also think there's this issue about engaging the community, about how you can protect children. A lot of disadvantaged communities where you've got programs for young people, there are community engagement actions that take place so that members of the community become part of the safeguarding process.
Thank you. Rox?
Thanks. Okay, and in this question, is there any recourse for bystanders who have witnessed something inappropriate and have basically done nothing about it?
Yeah, so both the Children's Act and the Sexual Offences Act makes provision to say that if what they've witnessed is a criminal transgression against a child, if you're aware that a child has been hurt or physically abused or sexually abused, you have to report it. I always joke and I say, when I visit the prison through an investigation, you often speak to inmates and the inmates will go, "Oh, I did nothing wrong. They framed me." Well, failing to report child abuse is the one crime that literally could put you in jail for doing nothing. If through the investigation, one could establish that a person knew about child abuse and didn't report it, both acts call for 5 years imprisonment. So you could end up in jail for 5 years on not reporting. It is one of those elements of the legislation that isn't policed very well, but certainly I think if failing to act, whether you witnessed it, whether you were aware of it, failing to act caused the child to be hurt more, then I do believe a prosecutor would push for prosecution in that space.
I also think, we're at a stage now here in South Africa where people are now becoming aware of the need to have these safeguarding policies and procedures. There are international standards out there around safeguarding children, where they're from international federations, the UNICEF safeguards, the IOC safeguards. And we live in a litigious society, and people who sit on boards of national sports federations, senior managers in national sports federations now are at risk. They're at risk of being sued, and they're at risk of being proven to have been negligent. And if you want to have a think about that, I recommend you go and watch Athlete A, which is showing on Netflix at the moment. And don't just think about the athletes who were abused. Think about the people around the athletes and what's actually happened to them.
Yeah.
Because this stuff is serious, and if national sports federations don't get their policies and procedures into the right place, get their insurance policies in the right place as well. That's one of the first things I say to people. If you're a national federation, have you got your public liability insurance in place, and director's liability insurance in place? But no, this can come back to bite people working in national federations who often are just volunteers, and it can bite them in a very big way. So I would strongly recommend that people start to take this area of work seriously.
Roxy, I know that we've reached the 11:30, so I don't want to keep people on here who may have planned something else in their diary. How many more questions have you got?
I've just got 2 more, Mark.
Okay, let's see if we can work through those then, and then,
Okay,
and then we can call it. Yeah.
If a person reports something inappropriate, can the whistleblower have legal action taken against them by the person they are reporting on?
They shouldn't be able to, because in your policy you should actually say that whistleblowers are protected, and I think Mark can speak on the law a bit better on that, but it certainly should be part of your policy about how whistleblowers will be protected and treated. Mark?
Yeah. So there's a couple of pieces of legislation that talks into. Firstly, if a child makes a disclosure to somebody else, to report that, there is a legal obligation. So there certainly could never be a civil claim against the person giving that information out. Secondly, one must understand the definition of hearsay evidence. So hearsay evidence isn't I heard it and then I said it. Hearsay evidence is, so I can testify to something I heard as long as I heard it. I can't testify to say so-and-so told me that they heard, because then I'm too far removed from the initial report. The second thing is that, as everybody knows, in most countries, certainly in South Africa, we have different levels of law, and the top drawer of all of our law is the Constitution. And in the Constitution, one of the elements of the Constitution talks into the rights of the child being paramount. And so if I'm going to bring a civil claim against someone, and the civil claim I'm going to bring, I could argue that when I acted in the best interests of the child. Well, the fact that the rights of the child are paramount means it outweighs the fact that you're now going to come after me for trying to safeguard the child. The other thing to consider is that once the disclosure is made anonymously, whether it be through the app or whether it be through a Dropbox that's outside the club manager and you can just stick something inside there, or whatever you're doing, there is a piece of legislation called Protected Disclosures Act. And the Protected Disclosures Act is very, very clear around the fact that when someone whistleblows, you may not, even if you are aware of who that person is, you may not disclose who that person is. So it's going to be very difficult to bring repercussions against a person when you cannot prove that they were the whistleblower.
The one thing I'd add into that, Mark, is that if somebody comes forward with a complaint, and that complaint then turns out to be a vexatious complaint, then that whistleblower could be subject to disciplinary action within your safeguarding policy. So there is a protection within the policy to stop people coming with frivolous or vexatious reports.
Absolutely, and there's two caveats to not disclosing who the reporter is. The first is that if what you are reporting is untrue, you relinquish your right to remain anonymous. And the second thing is, if what you are reporting is placing someone at risk. So as an example, as a 12-year-old, I make a comment to say, I cannot handle the pressure I'm under, and I'm going to take all of my mother's sleeping tablets tonight and I'm going to die. Well, then your protection, your anonymity can be disclosed because, again, rights of the child are paramount, and one needs to consider the right of life and all those things that are constitutionally based. Roxy, last question?
You answered the last question, it's fine, thanks.
Okay, good. Guys, I want to say to everybody, thank you for joining us today. I certainly hope it has been helpful. We did obviously say that if anybody wants to, get the newsletter, we will be posting this presentation up on our YouTube channel. We will disseminate the link through our newsletter. And then if there is anything that anybody would like to contact us about further coming out of this, or any assistance that you would like us to talk into, please feel free to reach out. It is the reason that we're here. So thank you very much, and God bless and be safe. Norman?
Yes, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure talking to everybody today, and I hope you'll help us take this agenda of keeping children and vulnerable adults in sport safe forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Norman.